I bet you didn't know these creepy facts that'll give you nightmares. Hallucinations come in very different forms. People who are beginning to go blind see very realistic and very absurd hallucinations. This is called Charles Bonnet syndrome. In one case, a woman was diagnosed with glaucoma. Her life was very normal until a trip to the grocery store triggered her hallucinations. The shelves would begin to drip and turn into thick mud. She could pull an item off the shelf, but the mud was too thick for her to actually put the item back. These hallucinations can become so vivid that people can see animals or vivid landscapes without them actually being there. In ancient China, there was a process where they would mummify people with honey. In order to do this, an elderly person would volunteer themselves. They'd usually already be pretty close to death. They would begin binge bathing in honey and only be given honey to eat. They waited until their entire digestive system was just full of honey. Then, when the volunteer died, they would be covered in honey for 100 years. After a century or so, the contents were turned into candy and said to heal broken bones. What? The Black Death was a pretty big deal centuries ago, and there's a reason it became an epidemic. The bacteria that's responsible for the Black Plague is unable to survive outside the body of its victims, but it has a secret weapon. It can disable its host's immune system. With nothing to oppose it, it can multiply quickly and overrun its victim very, very, very rapidly. Like, I'm talking about within hours. No one actually knows how Edgar Allan Poe died. All of his death records have been lost. Poe was just found in Baltimore's streets. Eerily, he was wearing someone else's clothes. He was in pretty bad shape. I mean, there's literally nothing left from his medical records. There's no copy of his death certificate. There are many speculations about how he actually died. I mean, he was only 40 years old. A lot of people don't know that Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street was inspired by a true story. It was published by the LA Times. A young boy suffered horrific nightmares and actually died in the middle of one. Wes Craven said, "The boy told his parents he was afraid to sleep, that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him. So he tried staying awake days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was already dead. He died while having a nightmare." I bet you didn't know these insane beauty trends from history. At one point, fermented urine was used as an anti-dandruff shampoo. It used to be believed that a woman's forehead was her most attractive feature, so women would pluck out their eyelashes, eyebrows, and even their hairline to elongate their forehead. In Victorian times, women would bathe in arsenic to make them look paler. The paler you were, the more wealthy you were. They would even draw veins on their skin. They wanted to be translucent. And if that didn't give them the pale complexion they were wanting, they would literally go to bloodletting. A sign of anemia is extreme paleness. They used to use x-rays for permanent hair removal. Like, yeah, if you sat in front of an x-ray for long enough, it'll burn your hair follicles and your hair won't grow back. But it's also causing an intense amount of damage under your skin as well. Obviously, that didn't last too long. I bet you didn't know about Reina Angelica Marroquin. She went by Angelica. She had immigrated from El Salvador, and she was murdered where her body remained unidentified and unfound for 30 years. In October of 1999, her remains were discovered. Inside a 55-gallon barrel hidden in the crawl space of a home in New York. 9 years after the resident at the time had moved in, he discovered the barrel and had a friend help him open it. To their horror, they found her mummified remains. During the autopsy, their first discoveries were she was of Hispanic descent and she was almost full term during pregnancy. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and her murderer, the previous owner of the home, Howard Elkins. In the 1960s, she was employed at his artificial plant factory, and during that time, they had an affair. It was believed that Howard had murdered her after she had told his wife about the affair and about her pregnancy. And after he murdered her, he stuffed her into a 55-gallon drum and hid her away in his crawl space and left her there even after selling the home. Immediately after Howard was questioned about his possible involvement, he took his own life. So he never had to face consequences for what he had done. After his death, they did a DNA test. His DNA matched that of the fetus found. After her remains were discovered, Angelica was sent back to El Salvador to be buried. And her mother was contacted. She was still alive, and she had spent this whole time wondering what had happened to her daughter. I bet you didn't know these animals are critically endangered. Now, what does critically endangered mean? It means they're at extremely high risk of becoming completely extinct in the wild, and their population will decrease by 80% over the next 3 generations. Great hammerhead sharks, blue whales, African elephants, lowland gorillas, African wild dogs, Aruba island rattlesnake, sea otters, and that's just to name a few. There are 7,079 critically endangered species in the world. I bet you didn't know these weird deaths that'll make living seem a lot easier. A Brazilian man was killed in 2013 when a cow came crashing through his roof and crushing him while he slept in his bed. A mayor in Maryland died while checking her town's sewage tanks. She accidentally fell in and drowned in 15 feet of human waste. A man died while trying to prove that the glass on the 24th floor of an office building was not breakable. He threw himself against it, and while it didn't break, it popped out of frame, and he fell down 24 floors. A 19th century lawyer accidentally shot himself while defending a murderer because he was trying to demonstrate how the supposed victim could have accidentally shot himself. It worked because the client was acquitted. I bet you didn't know about Andrew Dotson. October 2001, Galloway, Ohio. Andrew was only 20 years old. He had recently become a father, but had unfortunately got mixed up with the wrong kind of people. An incident that happened in September of 2001 had police coming around his home questioning him. When the news got out that police were coming around to the people who he was hanging around with, he became very nervous. Shortly thereafter, Andrew's body was found decomposing in a cornfield. He had been stabbed twice in the chest, once in the face. His attacker used a pickaxe. They also covered his body in lime, mistakenly using the kind that preserves bodies instead of helping them decompose. Police immediately started questioning those close to him and those that he spent most of his time with. That's when one friend pointed them towards James Conway. James was feeling nervous that Andrew would talk about a shooting that he was involved with. So he decided the best way to handle the situation was to eliminate Andrew. A friend of both James and Andrew went along with them on a drive out to the countryside with the plan to murder Andrew. The friend pretended to choke Andrew to death, hoping that would be enough to satisfy James. That was until James walked away with a pickaxe, and when he came back, it was covered in blood. James was arrested and found guilty. His murder of Andrew landed him on death row. I'm gonna bring a little hell. I'm gonna bring a little hell. I bet you didn't know these creepy facts that'll give you nightmares. The marriage between Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome of Burgundy was a very interesting one. When Philip died, Joanne refused to let him go. I mean, literally. She would not let them bury his body. And finally,